Taiwan and China, why is it so complicated? Today, we'll clearly explain one of those current affairs questions you're too embarrassed to ask now. Why are relations between Taiwan and China so complicated? You often hear terms like Taiwan contingency or China changing the status quo in the news or on social media, right? But when asked, is Taiwan part of China or is it an independent country? Surprisingly, few people can explain it accurately. The truth is, to properly understand this issue, you need to grasp one shocking fact. That is, China, the People's Republic of China, has never once governed Taiwan since its founding. Understanding just this one point completely changes how you see the Taiwan issue. In other words, China's current claim that Taiwan is part of its territory is more a political stance than a matter of historical succession. Meanwhile, Taiwan has existed since the post-war period as a de facto independent nation, operating under the name Republic of China with its own government and military. However, this relationship is not merely a bilateral dispute. It involves the United States, Japan, the United Nations, and even international law, making it a true microcosm of the global order. In this video, we'll organize the history of Taiwan and China chronologically, compare both sides' claims, and explain what changing the status quo means from the perspectives of international law and Japan's stance, using storytelling techniques to make it easy to understand. To put it simply, the essence of this issue isn't sovereignty, but who decides the will of the Taiwanese people. Watching until the end will change how you see the news. So first, let's look at the map. Understanding at a glance on the map, the tension born from 180 kilometers of sea. First, let's look at the map. The left side of the screen is mainland China. The right is Taiwan Island. Between them lies the Taiwan Strait. Its width is approximately 180 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from Tokyo to Nagoya. Separated by just that stretch of sea, on one side lies the People's Republic of China, PRC, under the Communist Party, and on the other the Republic of China, Taiwan, ROC, with its democratically elected government. This is the world's most closely watched sea border, because this 180-kilometer strait divides two sets of values: socialism and democracy, dictatorship and freedom. Besides the main island of Taiwan, there are the Penghu Islands and the Kinmen and Matsu Islands, located very close to mainland China. Kinmen is just a few kilometers off the coast of Fujian province. It's close enough to see the Chinese mainland through binoculars. In other words, Taiwan is geographically right next door, but politically it functions like a completely different country. This sense of being close yet distant symbolizes cross-strait relations. Behind China's call for unification and Taiwan's desire for maintaining the status quo lies over 70 years of history of division, born from this 180-kilometer stretch of sea. In the next chapter, we will examine when and how this division began. Let's organize the history chronologically. Why is Taiwan now the focus of the world? So far, we've established that Taiwan and China are separate entities, both geographically and politically. Then, why is this issue now shaking the world to such an extent? The reason is that the Taiwan Strait is a place that influences global peace and the economy to such an extent that it's called Asia's powder keg. China is now repeatedly conducting military exercises around Taiwan on an unprecedented scale. Fighter jets intrude into Taiwan's air defense identification zone almost daily, while warships are deployed in the sea. If miscalculations occur, this could rapidly escalate into conflict. The United States provides de facto support to Taiwan, and Japan has explicitly stated that stability in the Taiwan Strait is directly linked to Japan's national security. In other words, if a conflict erupts here, it would directly impact the entire Asian region. No, the global economy. And there's another factor. Taiwan also stands as the front line of democracy. It has experienced peaceful transfers of power through free elections, with freedom of speech and the press. In contrast, China operates under one-party dictatorship. This clash of values is precisely what elevates the Taiwan issue beyond a mere territorial dispute, making it a symbol of global democracy versus authoritarianism. The Taiwan issue is not some distant country's problem. It is a litmus test for the world order, directly impacting Japan and our very lives. In the next chapter, let's trace the historical origins of this conflict chronologically. Chronological Overview 1. From the Japanese rule period to the present. The origins of the island of Taiwan. From here, we will examine the relationship between Taiwan and China within the flow of history. This part will serve as the very foundation for subsequent discussions. The key point to grasp first is this: Taiwan has not always been part of China. Taiwan first came under the rule of a Chinese dynasty in 1683. The Qing dynasty incorporated Taiwan into its territory. However, it is crucial not to misunderstand that Taiwan was not considered China's core territory, and administrative control was quite limited. The Qing dynasty treated Taiwan more like an island at the edge of the mainland. They couldn't fully control it even when rebellions broke out, and they even issued orders warning people not to move there because it was dangerous. In other words, the Qing dynasty ruled Taiwan, but they didn't deeply integrate it. Then, in 1895, history took a major turn. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, which determined the outcome of the First Sino-Japanese War. Here, the Qing dynasty formally ceded Taiwan to Japan. This cession was clear under international law, and Taiwan came under complete Japanese rule for the next 50 years. In Taiwan, Japan developed railways, medical care, education infrastructure, and overhauled the administrative system. While there were positive and negative aspects, Taiwan's modernization advanced significantly. The lingering Japanese influence in Taiwan's streetscapes, architecture, and railway culture today stems from this era. To summarize this in one sentence, Taiwan was incorporated into China for only about 200 years under the Qing dynasty. The subsequent 50 years were under Japanese rule. The perception that it was always part of China differs from historical fact. Then, in 1945, Japan's defeat in the war set Taiwan's history in motion once more. The next chapter will examine the era of post-war settlement, how Japanese rule ended and Taiwan was transferred to the Republic of China. Post-war settlement and the Republic of China's takeover. Now, this is the most crucial part, where Japanese rule ended and Taiwan began its journey toward its current state. You often see these arguments on social media. Taiwan was returned to China in 1945. Taiwan went back to China immediately after the war. Actually, there's a major misunderstanding here. In 1945, Japan was defeated. At that time, the Allied powers instructed the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek's government, to temporarily occupy and administer Taiwan militarily. This was strictly military occupation and not a transfer of sovereignty, territorial return. Why? Because Taiwan's ultimate sovereignty was to be determined by a peace treaty. In other words, as of 1945, it was still undecided which country Taiwan would formally belong to. Nevertheless, in reality, in October of that year, the Republic of China government, Kuomintang regime, entered Taiwan and took over the administration, military, and police. This is called the takeover of Taiwan. However, the problems began here. The society that had been stable under Japanese rule rapidly descended into chaos under the Republic of China's governance. Corruption and malpractice became rampant. Administrative incompetence, soaring prices, deteriorating public safety. Then, in 1947, clashes between residents and authorities escalated into large-scale riots. This became the greatest tragedy in Taiwan's history, the February 28th incident. This incident deepened the distrust many Taiwanese residents felt toward the Republic of China government. Here, I will briefly summarize the February 28th incident, an event absolutely essential to understanding Taiwan's modern history. The February 28th incident refers to the conflict that erupted across Taiwan on February 28, 1947, between the local population and the Republic of China government. The background included corruption and malpractice by the ROC government living conditions that had deteriorated since the Japanese era, and oppressive rule over the populace, which had caused discontent to grow within Taiwanese society. The trigger was a shooting incident during a crackdown in Taipei. This escalated across the island, leading to a violent suppression by government forces. Thousands to tens of thousands of people are said to have been killed. This incident planted a deep distrust of the ROC government within Taiwanese society, marking the beginning of the long-term repression later known as the White Terror. It is an essential historical event for understanding the background of Taiwanese people's feelings toward their government. Around the same time, on the Chinese mainland, the civil war between the Kuomintang, Republic of China, and the Communist Party, later the People's Republic of China, intensified. Ultimately, the Kuomintang was defeated, and in 1949, the Republic of China government retreated to Taiwan. On the mainland, the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong regime, was established. The crucial point here is that, at this moment, two governments came into existence in China. Mainland, People's Republic of China, PRC, Taiwan, Republic of China, ROC. And from this point until now, the PRC, Chinese Communist Party regime, has never governed Taiwan. This is the most fundamental fact of the Taiwan issue. To summarize thus far, in 1945, Taiwan came under the administration of the Republic of China as a military occupation from Japan. Sovereignty remained undetermined. In 1949, the Kuomintang retreated to Taiwan, creating a two Chinas situation with the PRC. From that time until now, Taiwan has been governed by the ROC, the Taiwan government. In the next chapter 6, we will explain how China and Taiwan have interacted for over 50 years since then. Chronological overview. Part 2. The Cold War and Division. Cross-strait relations from the 1950s to the 1970s. From here, we examine how Taiwan and China engaged with each other from the 1950s to the 1970s, following the emergence of two Chinas in 1949. The defining keyword for this era is solidification of division. The PRC, Chinese Communist Party, and the ROC, Republic of China in Taiwan, each insisted they were the legitimate government, refusing to yield. 1950. The Korean War breaks out. This had a major impact on the Taiwan issue. The United States decided that Taiwan must not become communist and dispatched the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait. This effectively marked the beginning of a military protection system for Taiwan. Simultaneously, China, PRC, suspended its plans to liberate Taiwan by force. From this point, both sides entered an unstable balance of military confrontation, plus avoiding direct conflict. In 1954 and 1958, the Taiwan Strait crises erupted, with the Chinese military conducting artillery bombardments. Particularly during the second crisis of 1958, the Chinese military launched intense daily bombardments. The Taiwanese military defended desperately. The United States explicitly pledged support for Taiwan, creating a situation on the brink of full-scale war. This event symbolized how, during the Cold War era, the Taiwan Strait was one of the most dangerous places in the world. Until the 1960s, the international community was the opposite of what it is today. At that time, Taiwan, the Republic of China, participated in the UN as the representative of China, while the PRC, People's Republic of China, was not admitted to the UN. In other words, the world recognized China equals the Taiwan government. This was due to the United States prioritizing Taiwan and, within the Cold War structure, not wanting to recognize Communist China. In 1971, the United Nations recognized the PRC as the sole representative of China, and Taiwan, ROC, effectively withdrew from the UN. This is the famous UN Resolution 2758. From this point, Taiwan's international isolation began, and the world's diplomatic recognition underwent a major shift. To summarize, 1950s. The US protects Taiwan. Military clashes occur repeatedly through the 1960s. Taiwan represents China at the UN. 1971. The PRC represents China. Taiwan becomes isolated internationally. In other words, the era up until the 1970s was a time when both China and Taiwan continued to assert that only we are China. In the next chapter 7, we will delve deeper into what this change in UN representation meant, including from the perspective of international law. The change in UN representation, Taiwan's international disappearance and its background. So far, we have examined the solidification of cross-strait confrontation during the 1950s and 1960s. Then, in 1971, an event occurred that became a historic turning point for Taiwan and for the world. That event was UN Resolution 2758. UN Resolution 2758, in a nutshell, determined that the PRC, communist regime, represents China, and Taiwan, ROC, loses its qualification to represent China. Consequently, Taiwan, ROC, which had been the UN representative for China, lost its seat, and its isolation within the international community deepened thereafter. However, this decision contains one crucial point. That is, Resolution 2758 did not decide anything about Taiwan's status. That is the point. Whether Taiwan is part of China, who holds sovereignty over Taiwan, how to handle territorial issues, Resolution 2758 contains absolutely nothing on these matters. This was not merely the result of a majority vote. Behind it, several major political dynamics were at play. America's strategy. Against the USSR as China and the Soviet Union fell out, America began thinking, we want to team up with China to counter the USSR. Within this shift, support for Taiwan weakened, and the US leaned toward recognizing the PRC, the voting power of developing nations. Many newly independent nations in Asia and Africa followed an anti-imperialist line, supporting China over Taiwan, which was aligned with the Western Bloc. The presence of 800 million people and nuclear power status, keeping the vast nation of China outside the UN itself, had become unrealistic. The issue of effective control. The view gained strength that the PRC actually governs all of China, and it is unreasonable for the Taiwan government to represent China. These factors converged, and in 1971, the tide of the international community shifted abruptly. That is the story. The impact of this resolution was immense. Overnight, Taiwan ceased to be a UN member state and severed formal diplomatic relations with most major countries. In 1972, Japan also normalized relations with China, shifting to unofficial relations with Taiwan. The United States established diplomatic ties with China in 1979, terminating its official relations with Taiwan. However, the crucial point here is, Taiwan did not vanish. It was merely removed from the main stage of international politics. In reality, Taiwan continues to function as a fully independent political entity, possessing a government, maintaining a military, experiencing changes in government through elections. To summarize, Resolution 2758 only determined that the representative of China is the PRC. It did not decide whether Taiwan is part of China. Realpolitik in international politics, strategy against the USSR, rise of emerging nations, China's growing presence, formed the backdrop. Taiwan was subsequently placed in the position of a non-existent country within the international community. And in the next chapter, we will examine the changes of the 1980s and 1990s, when Taiwan finally democratized and a distinct Taiwanese identity began to emerge. The 5 real reasons behind UN Resolution 2758. 1. Because the US wanted to use China during the Cold War, the US's greatest enemy was the Soviet Union. However, by the late 1960s, relations between China, PRC, and the Soviet Union rapidly deteriorated. Sino-Soviet split. Here, the US considered, to counter the Soviet Union, it would be better to team up with China. Based on this thinking, the Nixon administration pursued improved relations with China, leading to the Nixon visit to China in 1972. In other words, the 1971 transfer of UN representation was part of America's anti-Soviet strategy. 2. The rapid increase in developing nations changed the power map of votes. From the 1950s to the 1970s, a wave of independence swept across Asia and Africa. UN membership surged from 1945, 51 countries to over 140 countries by the 1970s. Many of these new members opposed colonial rule, were anti-Western and anti-imperialist, meaning pro-China. Taiwan, the Kuomintang government, was seen as collaborating with Japan and part of the Western camp, leading to a gradual decline in its support. 3. China, PRC, had become too large and militarily powerful to ignore. By the 1970s, China had become a nation of 800 million people, a nuclear power, a geopolitical superpower, and had grown too significant to exclude from the UN. Countries began to consider it would be unnatural not to admit such a major power into the UN. This pragmatic judgment led to growing support for the PRC. 4. Taiwan's legitimacy weakened amid the One China debate. The Kuomintang government, Taiwan, claimed, "We are the legitimate government representing all of China." But the world began to think, wait, isn't the PRC actually governing mainland China? Even by the international law standard of effective control, the notion of Taiwan equals China's representative was starting to diverge from reality. 5. The US itself judged it could not fully defend Taiwan. The US at the time was exhausted by the Vietnam War, and its true sentiment was, we don't want to expand the front lines in East Asia. As a result, it's more advantageous to team up with China against the Soviet Union than to keep defending Taiwan and confronting China. That was the conclusion. Support for Taiwan at the UN cooled rapidly. Behind Resolution 2758 lay great power realism. The reason UN representation shifted from Taiwan to China was never about historical justice or Taiwan's will. America's anti-Soviet strategy, the rise of emerging nations, the growing presence of China as a massive state, the weakening of Taiwan's representative status, America's true desire to avoid military burdens in East Asia. These factors converged, forming the international political current to transfer representation from Taiwan to China. The wave of democratization and the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, the moment Taiwan became Taiwan. Taiwan vanished from the United Nations in the 1970s, but this was not the beginning of its decline. Rather, It marked the start of Taiwan awakening as Taiwan. From this point, Taiwan underwent a dramatic transformation rare in Asia. Dictatorship, democratization, direct elections, self-determination by its people. This change would rapidly escalate tensions with China. 1987. Taiwan finally lifted its martial law after a full 38 years. Subsequently, it rapidly advanced freedom of speech and the press, formation of opposition parties, vigorously growing civic movements, and the establishment of an electoral system transforming into one of Asia's most free and open societies. Another major turning point came in 1996. Taiwan held its first historic election where the president was chosen by direct popular vote. This fully established Taiwan as a democratic nation. China reacted with fierce opposition. If Taiwan democratizes and becomes another country, unification will become impossible forever. Growing increasingly alarmed, the Chinese government took highly provocative actions between 1995 and 1996, conducting multiple missile drills and firing missiles into the waters immediately adjacent to Taiwan. This became the third Taiwan Strait crisis. The world was shaken. The United States dispatched 2 aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Strait area as a message that it would not abandon Taiwan. This created a tense situation where both sides were locked in a standoff. From China's perspective, Taiwan's democratization appeared to be a path toward de facto independence. The more democratic Taiwan became, the stronger the Taiwanese people's sense that we are different from China grew. Indeed, around this time, opinion polls showed a sharp increase in people identifying as Taiwanese. China perceived this as the greatest threat to national unification. In short, this era can be summarized as Taiwan, democracy blossomed rapidly. China, growing impatience for unification led to a hardline stance. United States intervened, demonstrating its resolve to defend Taiwan. The intertwining power dynamics among these 3 parties shaped the prototype of the modern Taiwan Strait situation. And in Taiwan, from this period onward, the identity that Taiwan is Taiwan became firmly established. The next chapter will cover the political fluctuations within Taiwan since the 2000s, its periods of rapprochement and rupture with China, and the journey leading up to the current administration. Why the PRC places extreme importance on Taiwan. 3 pillars. 1. Military and geopolitics, because it is the keyhole of the first island chain. Taiwan is the greatest obstacle for the Chinese military to reach the Pacific, and conversely, it is also the breakthrough point. What is the first island chain? A defensive line, containment line, encircling China from the Pacific side, involving the US, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, etc. Okinawa, US military's main base. Taiwan controls both sea and air, Philippines. These form a straight line blocking China's expansion. Unless the Chinese Navy breaks through here, it cannot deploy large-scale forces into the Pacific. Losing Taiwan would cause the US-Japan first island chain to collapse, much like losing the center of a chessboard. Conversely, if China seizes Taiwan, it can freely deploy military forces into the Pacific, push back US and Japanese forces in one fell swoop, secure maritime sea lanes, encircle Japan's Nansei Islands. In other words, from China's perspective, Taiwan is a military strategic asset and the key to the Pacific. It is 2. Symbol of national unity, the Communist Party's legitimacy issue. Since its founding, the Chinese Communist Party has asserted Taiwan is part of China. If Taiwan were to become established as a de facto independent nation, it would negate the Communist Party's claim. The legitimacy of its rule over the people would be shaken. It would also set a precedent for independence in Xinjiang and Tibet. In other words, the Taiwan issue touches the very foundation of the regime. Therefore, for the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan is not only a military issue, but also a political and psychological matter of life and death. 3. Economy and technology. The existence of TSMC, world's most advanced semiconductor. Taiwan is home to the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturer, TSMC. This is the heart of the global high-tech industry. Even the US depends on it, and China desperately wants this technology. Particularly, China cannot produce advanced chips due to US sanctions, making Taiwan's semiconductor technology so crucial, it can be called a strategic resource. In other words, for China, Taiwan is a military stronghold, a symbol of regime stability, and a treasure trove of technology. In all 3 factors, Taiwan has become a strategic point China cannot afford to lose. That is precisely why the PRC is extremely sensitive and hardline toward Taiwan. Approach and breakdown, and the present. The great turmoil in cross-strait relations in the 2000s. In the late 1990s, Taiwan began its journey as a democratic nation, while China rose to become a global powerhouse through economic growth. These two movements collided, ushering in an era where Taiwan and China's relationship intensely cycled between approach and rupture. From the 2000s to the present, cross-strait relations can be understood through three major waves. First wave, the birth of the DPP and China's vigilance. 2000, Taiwan's first ever peaceful transfer of power. A pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party, DPP administration, takes office. China reacts with fierce opposition. Warns, "We will use force if independence is declared." Systematically obstructs Taiwan's international participation. Accelerates the pace of military buildup. Taiwan became increasingly isolated internationally, and China began a period of pressure, continuously exerting pressure on Taiwan. Second wave, the era of the greatest approach in history. In 2008, Taiwan's government transitioned to the Kuomintang KMT administration. This administration adopted a policy of prioritizing the economy and expanding exchanges with China. The result? Direct flights to mainland China commenced, tourist numbers exploded. The Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, ECFA, was signed. China's Xi Jinping and Taiwan's Ma Ying-jeou shared a historic handshake. 2015 Singapore. Cross-strait relations entered a period of unprecedented stability, described as a mood of rapprochement. However, among Taiwan's youth, concerns grew that Taiwan would be swallowed up by China. This anxiety erupted in the 2014 Sunflower Student Movement. Students occupied the legislature in opposition to the trade agreement with China. Society became deeply divided, and Taiwan's sense of identity consciousness surged dramatically. The third wave, Taiwan's independence aspirations and China's hardline stance. In 2016, the Democratic Progressive Party's Tsai Ing-wen administration took office. While advocating maintaining the status quo, Tsai Ing-wen clearly stated her stance to protect Taiwan's democracy and sovereignty. China responded by using diplomatic pressure to poach countries with diplomatic ties to Taiwan one after another, conducting continuous military exercises around Taiwan, sending large numbers of aircraft to intimidate and imposing economic sanctions on countries that referred to Taiwan as a state. China's stance became particularly hardline after the 2019 Hong Kong national security law. Taiwanese public opinion rapidly shifted toward the view that China's values are too different, pushing independence sentiment to its highest level ever. The 2024 election victory of DPP's Lai Ching-te also stems from this heightened Taiwanese self-identity. To summarize, cross-strait relations since the 2000s have followed these three waves. Independence-minded DPP, China intensifies pressure. Kuomintang, economic rapprochement, but Taiwanese identity resists. Tsai Ing-wen era, Taiwan champions democracy, China escalates military pressure. These three overlapping waves have sustained the current state of tension persists, but war is avoided. The next chapter delves into the core question. Why is the fact that the PRC does not govern Taiwan so crucial? The PRC has never governed Taiwan, reaffirming the facts and their significance. Now, having traced the history thus far, we enter the most misunderstood core issue. That is the fact that the People's Republic of China, PRC, has never governed Taiwan since its founding. Most debates seen on social media are confused precisely because they fail to grasp this single point. Fact clarification: PRC and ROC emerged as separate countries. First, let's clarify. PRC, Chinese Communist Party regime, established 1949 Republic of China, Taiwan government, retreated to Taiwan, also 1949. Meaning, as of 1949, mainland China had the PRC, Communist Party regime, ROC, Republic of China government, in Taiwan. Two governments coexisted, and since then, PRC jurisdiction has never extended to Taiwan. Police military courts, tax authorities laws, everything in Taiwan has been operated by the Republic of China, Taiwan government. This is an unshakable fact. From an international law perspective, the PRC's history of governance is zero. This is crucial from an international law perspective. 1945. Japan relinquished Taiwan, but to whom it would belong remained undecided. 1951. The San Francisco Peace Treaty also left Taiwan's sovereignty undetermined. Since 1949, only the ROC has exercised effective control over Taiwan. In other words, there exists neither a treaty nor historical fact stating that the PRC inherited Taiwan. This is not saying Taiwan is an independent nation, but merely confirming the fact that the PRC has never historically governed Taiwan. Why is this fact important? Overlooking this single point causes the entire argument to go off track. China asserts that Taiwan is part of China, and national reunification is a historical inevitability. But underlying this premise is the political narrative that China equals PRC, and PRC is China's successor state. However, in reality, the PRC has zero history of governing Taiwan. The ROC has governed Taiwan for over 75 years. Therefore, the essence of the Taiwan issue is not China's internal affair, but rather the problem of the historical coexistence of two governments. To summarize, the PRC has never governed Taiwan, historical fact. The ROC continues to govern Taiwan, fact of effective control. Under international law, Taiwan's status remains undetermined. Therefore, the Taiwan issue is not an internal affair, but an international issue. Only by understanding this fact can you deeply grasp the next chapter, comparing each side's claims. Now, in Chapter 11, let's clearly organize the PRC's claims and the ROC's claims in a table for easy understanding. Comparison of PRC and ROC claims. One China uses the same words but has different meanings. So far, we've examined the historical context of Taiwan and China. Here, we want to clarify once more the People's Republic of China, PRC, Republic of China, ROC, equals Taiwan government, differences in their positions. In fact, these two entities often use the same words to refer to completely different meanings. A prime example is One China. One China means different things to each side. To state the conclusion first, the PRC's One China equals the People's Republic of China represents China, and Taiwan is part of China. The ROC's One China equals the Republic of China is the legitimate government of China. In other words, both sides use the same slogan, but they are describing different worlds. This discrepancy is the root cause of the long-standing confusion. Let's now compare the claims of both sides in a table. PRC, People's Republic of China. Position: legitimacy themselves as the sole legitimate government of China. Territorial view: Taiwan is an inseparable part of China. Sovereignty: the Taiwan issue is China's internal affair. Unification policy: peaceful reunification is the basis, but the use of force is not ruled out if necessary. International stance requires countries to accept the position that Taiwan is part of China. ROC, Republic of China, the Taiwan government. Position: legitimacy. The Republic of China is a state continuing since 1912. We are the legitimate government. Territorial view, official stance. The Republic of China's territory encompasses all of China, constitutionally, currently ambiguous. Reality: Taiwan functions as the government exercising effective control over Kinmen and Matsu. Sovereignty: Taiwan lives under its own government. Chinese rule has no jurisdiction whatsoever. International stance: status quo. Neither independence nor unification is pursued urgently. Democracy is Taiwan's foundation. The crucial point here is the international community did not accept the PRC's claim. They merely recognized the PRC as a state. For example, Japan stated in the 1972 Japan-China Joint Communique that it understands and respects China's position. But this does not mean Japan acknowledged that Taiwan is part of China. Similarly, the United States has adopted its own interpretation, the One China policy, deliberately maintaining ambiguity regarding Taiwan's status. This stems from the emphasis on the democratic principle that Taiwan's future should be decided by its own people. To summarize, the PRC and ROC are talking about One China, but mean different things. The PRC asserts Taiwan is part of its own country. The ROC continues to exist as the government exercising effective control over Taiwan. The international community recognizes the PRC but does not address Taiwan's sovereignty. Understanding this discrepancy in meaning is the first step to grasping why the Taiwan issue has become so complex. In the next Chapter 12, we will explain how Taiwan's status has been treated from an international law perspective. Taiwan's status under international law, a unique island belonging to no one. We've compared the PRC and ROC's claims so far, but what matters is how Taiwan has been treated in the world of international law. In fact, Taiwan's status is a very rare condition, an undetermined territory not defined by any treaty. Today we'll organize the reasons for this through the flow of three treaties. Qing Dynasty, cession to Japan. The first point is the Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895. As a result of the First Sino-Japanese War, the Qing Dynasty explicitly stated, Taiwan and the Penghu Islands are permanently ceded to Japan. This cession carries extremely strong legal weight under international law, meaning from 1895 to 1945, for 50 years, Taiwan was entirely Japanese territory. This is an indisputable fact. Japan, Taiwan's status was undetermined. In 1945, Japan surrendered and abandoned Taiwan. Crucially, however, Japan did not transfer sovereignty over Taiwan to any other entity. The Republic of China, Kuomintang government, entered Taiwan, but this was strictly military occupation and not a transfer of sovereignty. The often misunderstood claim that Taiwan was returned to China in 1945 is, strictly speaking, not accurate. The international decision at the time stipulated that Taiwan's final status would be determined by a peace treaty, San Francisco Peace Treaty. Then, in 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed to finalize post-war arrangements. Here, Japan explicitly stated to renounce Taiwan and the pescadores. However, it never once mentioned to whom it was being transferred. This is the crux of the Taiwan issue. Neither the PRC nor the ROC participated in this treaty. Therefore, the decision to transfer Taiwan to the PRC transfer Taiwan to the ROC does not exist at all under the treaty. Under international law, Japan relinquished sovereignty over Taiwan, but its subsequent status remained undecided and suspended. Note: UN Resolution 2758 also does not determine Taiwan's status. Often confused, UN Resolution 2758 in 1971 recognized China's representation only to the PRC regarding Taiwan's sovereignty. Taiwan's status, who Taiwan belongs to it, decided absolutely nothing. In other words, under international law, Taiwan's status has remained unresolved from 1951 to the present. Summarizing up to this point, 1895 to 1945. Taiwan was Japanese territory, clearly defined by treaty. 1945. The Republic of China took over Taiwan as a military occupation. 1951. Japan renounced Taiwan, but did not specify its future status. No treaty exists where either the PRC or ROC gained sovereignty over Taiwan. UN Resolution 2758 only determined China's representative, not Taiwan's sovereignty. Therefore, under international law, Taiwan is an island not determined to belong to either the PRC or the ROC, a position that is extremely unique in the world. In the next chapter 13, we will explain how Japan has acted within this limbo state and what the Japan-Taiwan and Japan-China relationships look like. Japan and Taiwan-China, from the 1972 Japan-China Joint Communique to the present. Understanding Japan's position is absolutely essential to grasping the Taiwan issue. This is because Japan was Taiwan's former colonial power. Japan shares deep economic and cultural ties with Taiwan. China is a vital trading partner, and geographically, a Taiwan contingency could become a Japanese contingency. This unique position is why, today, we'll organize Japan's stance. 1. History. 2. Diplomatic documents. 3. Security into these three categories. 1. Japan's stance was established in the 1972 Japan-China Joint Communique. In 1972, Japan recognized the People's Republic of China as the representative government of China. This is the Japan-China Joint Communique. However, the crucial point here is that regarding Taiwan's sovereignty, Japan does not recognize it. The communique states, the Chinese side asserts that Taiwan is an inalienable part of the territory of the People's Republic of China. The Japanese government understands and respects this position of the Chinese side. This is the key point. Understands and respects, accepts. In other words, Japan simply understands China's position as that's their stance, has not accepted that Taiwan is part of China. This ambiguous phrasing allowed Japan to normalize diplomatic relations with China while maintaining de facto ties with Taiwan. 2. Japan and Taiwan are in a de facto alliance state. Japan does not have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. However, in practice, they have an extremely strong relationship. The reasons are: Japan's Practical Liaison Office. Established in 1972, Japan-Taiwan Exchange Association effectively functions like an embassy. Taiwan's Practical Liaison Office, Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in Japan, also effectively functions like an embassy. Furthermore, economic cooperation, tourism, technical cooperation, disaster relief, cultural exchange, etc., effectively binding them at a quasi-allied nation level. Symbolically, during the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake, Taiwan sent the largest ever relief funds. 3. Security. A Taiwan contingency directly impacts Japan's southwestern islands. So why is Japan so sensitive about the Taiwan issue? The reason, in a word, is geographically, they're just too close. The distance between Taiwan and Yonaguni Island, Japan's southernmost point, is a mere 110 kilometers, Furthermore, the Taiwan Strait is the lifeline for Japan's energy imports. Consequently, Japanese government documents have explicitly stated the following for the first time since 2021. 2021. Defense. White paper, Taiwan's stability is vital to Japan's security. We will closely monitor the situation in Taiwan as a matter of grave concern. This effectively acknowledges that a Taiwan contingency equals a major impact on Japan's security. The US shares this view. The Japan-US joint statement emphasizes the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait to an unprecedented degree. To summarize, Japan does not recognize China's claims, maintains an ambiguous strategy, avoiding interference in Taiwan's sovereignty, economically aligned with China, while sharing values and security interests with Taiwan and the US. In other words, Japan, legally neutral but practically closer to Taiwan's side, is pursuing this delicate balancing act in diplomacy. A key point to understand here is that Japan believes Taiwan's future should be decided by the Taiwanese people themselves. This is a natural stance for a democratic nation. In the next chapter 14, we finally reach the climax. What is changing the status quo by force? Why are China's actions problematic? We'll explain this more clearly than anyone else. What is changing the status quo by force? Why are China's actions problematic? Now, we've finally reached the core of this series. You often hear in the news, China changing the status quo by force. Truthfully, very few people can correctly explain what this phrase means. Today, we'll clarify this issue from the perspectives of Taiwan's historical facts and international law in the clearest way possible. First, the fundamental premise. What is the status quo in Taiwan? Simply put, the status quo is Taiwan has been governed by its own government, the Republic of China, for over 75 years. PRC rule has never extended there. This is the current state equals status quo. The international community implicitly recognizes this status quo. That's precisely why many countries do not establish formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but treat Taiwan as a distinct democratic nation with deep substantive ties, and do not recognize China's sovereignty over Taiwan, maintaining this delicate balance. So, what is changing the status quo by force? International law defines it as follows: an act of attempting to alter an existing state of control through force, intimidation, or pressure. In Taiwan's case, there is no history of PRC rule. Therefore, China demanding unification by force or subjugation through military pressure is precisely an act of attempting to gain new control over an ungoverned territory by force, casu status quo alteration. This is the crucial point. Why is China's action problematic? The world criticizes China for three reasons. 1. Because the PRC has never ruled Taiwan in history. It is not a matter of return it, but rather attempting to seize it anew. This violates a fundamental principle of the international community. 2. Because the display of force violates fundamental rules of international law. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter explicitly prohibits the use of force to resolve international disputes. Mass fighter jet incursions into the Taiwan Strait and encirclement drills are viewed as problematic, changing the status quo through intimidation. 3. Because Taiwan is a democracy and the will of its people cannot be ignored. Taiwanese public opinion shows over 90% do not desire unification. Younger generations exhibit stronger Taiwanese identity. In democratic societies, the principle is that the will of the people takes absolute priority. Forcing unification from outside while ignoring this is seen as a challenge to the international order itself. The core issue in the Taiwan question is not, is Taiwan part of China? The crux is this: the PRC has no history of ruling Taiwan. Meanwhile, the ROC has exercised effective control for over 75 years. Therefore, changing this control constitutes a change of the status quo. In other words, PRC's claim, weak historical and international legal basis, ROC's governance, strong foundation based on long-term effective control. This asymmetry is the essence of the tension across the Taiwan Strait. To summarize, the status quo means Taiwan being governed by the Taiwanese government. The PRC has zero history of governing Taiwan, yet it pressures for unification backed by force. Forceful alteration of the status quo. A democratic nation being forcibly subjugated is a grave issue for international order. The essence of the Taiwan issue. The asymmetry of history and international law. Understanding this reveals why the US, Japan, and Europe strongly restrain China. The next chapter 15 addresses, will a Taiwan contingency really happen? If so, what form would it take? The part viewers are most concerned about. Will a Taiwan crisis happen? Probability and specific scenarios. Now we reach the climax of the Taiwan issue. The question the entire world is watching is, will a Taiwan crisis, Taiwan invasion, actually happen? Today, we'll set aside all the hype and wishful thinking to simply explain the 5 scenarios experts are actually considering. Conclusion: a sudden, full-scale war is unlikely. Many military analysts agree that a sudden, full-scale invasion, like the Normandy landings, carries far too great a risk. There are 3 reasons. The Taiwan Strait is prone to rough seas, making it unsuitable for military operations. Taiwan's mountainous terrain would lead to urban warfare, prolonging the conflict. US and Japanese military intervention is highly likely. In other words, from China's perspective, they want to avoid a full-scale invasion without a guarantee of success. So what scenarios exist? Scenario 1. Gray zone, most likely. The middle ground between the use of force and war. This is the approach China excels at. Examples: Chinese vessels provoke collisions near Taiwan, mass deployment of fishing boats and militia vessels, mass incursions by military aircraft to exhaust Taiwan's forces, cyber attacks to paralyze government functions. Advantages for China: low cost. International community finds it difficult to intervene. Taiwanese society becomes exhausted and collapses from within. This is considered the most likely scenario. Scenario 2. Blockade, next most likely. China blocks Taiwan's surrounding seas and airspace, cuts off oil and food supplies, paralyzes Taiwan's economy, claims to the international community that it is not military force. In fact, during the 2022 and 2023 military exercises, a rehearsal for a Taiwan blockade was conducted. This is a scenario that Taiwan, Japan, and the United States are all extremely wary of. Scenario 3. Mass missile launch plus intimidation. China may adopt a strategy of launching a massive barrage of missiles toward all of Taiwan to exert surrender pressure. The objectives are to psychologically corner the Taiwanese government and provoke internal divisions, to achieve victory before battle, per Sun Tzu's philosophy. However, Taiwan's resistance would likely intensify, accelerating US intervention, making the execution threshold relatively high. Scenario 4. Limited amphibious assault. Not a full-scale invasion, but targeting only outlying islands, e.g. Kinmen Island, Matsu Islands. Advantages: small-scale operation makes US military intervention difficult, can be presented domestically in China as advancing unification. Kinmen Island in particular is very close to Taiwan's main island and has a history of frequent combat. Scenario 5. Full-scale invasion, least likely. A scenario where the Chinese military lands on Taiwan's main island to achieve unification by force. Why is this currently unlikely? Harsh weather conditions in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan's military is specialized in defense. US intervention would make the operation disastrous. Urban warfare and guerrilla warfare would drag on China's economy, would suffer fatal damage. However, it is crucial to note that the possibility is not zero. When might China act? Many experts note that China has 2 key milestones, 2035 and 2049. 2035, a milestone for military modernization. 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. Xi Jinping has set unification as a goal. However, at the present time, China faces economic slowdown, strengthening cooperation between the US, Japan, Australia, and India, rising democratic consciousness in Taiwan, and other high-risk factors. Therefore, short-term military action is likely to be restrained. To summarize, the most likely scenario is gray zone warfare or blockade. Full-scale invasion is the least probable. However, China's long-term strategy includes Taiwan unification, so complacency is unwise. In the next chapter 16, we will clearly explain what impact would a Taiwan contingency have on Japan. What would a Taiwan crisis bring to Japan? 5 key impacts. A Taiwan crisis is not just Taiwan's problem, because Japan is the country closest to Taiwan. Japan's maritime shipping relies on the Taiwan Strait. Japan shares a security framework with the United States. This places Japan on the geopolitical front line. Today, we'll simply explain what a Taiwan crisis could bring to Japan from 5 perspectives. The possibility of Japan's southwestern islands becoming a war zone. From Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost point, to Taiwan is just 110 kilometers. This distance is closer than from Fukuoka to Oita. If conflict erupts around Taiwan, the following areas are highly likely to be affected: Yonaguni Island, Ishigaki Island, Miyako Island, Naha, Okinawa, Main Island, where US military bases in Japan are concentrated. The Southwest Islands, in particular, are said to be at high risk of being drawn into the war zone because they would become a transit route for Chinese, Taiwanese, and US military forces. Japan's logistics and energy supply would be directly impacted. Japan imports over 90% of its oil from the Middle East. Many of these import ships pass through the waters east of Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait. If the Taiwan Strait is blockaded, oil shipments to Japan would be severely disrupted. Gasoline and electricity prices would skyrocket. Manufacturing would halt, semiconductor supplies would become even scarcer. TSMC shutdown. In other words, a Taiwan contingency has the potential to directly halt Japan's economy. The Japan-US alliance would automatically be drawn in. If a Taiwan contingency occurs, US forces in Japan would operate from bases within Japan. Japan would bear its role as a host nation. Inevitably, Japanese territory would become a logistical support base for warring parties. Particularly crucial are Yokosuka, 7th Fleet, Kadena Air Base, Futenma Air Base, Misawa Air Base. All of these would become major operational bases during a Taiwan contingency. In other words, Japan cannot escape its structure of being geographically drawn in. This is the reality: evacuation, communication disruptions, logistics stagnation. Should a Taiwan contingency occur, Japan could face the following impacts domestically. Evacuation may become necessary in the Southwest Islands. Communication satellites and infrastructure could be attacked, causing communication disruptions. Logistics would stagnate, leading to shortages of food and daily necessities, a sharp decline in the tourism industry, sudden stock price fluctuations, and yen depreciation. Especially in the Southwest Islands and Okinawa Prefecture, some municipalities are actually advancing evacuation drill plans. Preparations are progressing to this extent. Japan's diplomacy will be put to the test. A Taiwan contingency will simultaneously test the three pillars of Japanese diplomacy: economic relations with China's security, relations with the United States, shared democratic values with Taiwan. Since all pillars are indispensable to Japan, it will likely be forced to make a decision on which side to clearly take. This will become the biggest diplomatic challenge since the war. To summarize, a Taiwan contingency is not just Taiwan's problem. Japan is geographically close, with the Southwest Islands potentially becoming a war zone. Logistics and energy would be directly impacted. Japan would be drawn in through the Japan-US alliance. Civilian life would be significantly impacted. Japan's diplomacy faces critical decisions. In the next chapter 17, we tackle the fundamental question: why does China still insist on unification? Understanding through national strategy, historical perspective, and domestic politics. Why is the PRC so fixated on unification? 3 core reasons. China uses strong language regarding Taiwan, such as core interests and unification at any cost. Why such an uncompromising stance? The reasons can be broadly organized into 3 pillars. Taiwan is the keyhole of the Pacific. Taiwan is the center of the first island chain, lined by the US, Japan, the Philippines, and others. This island chain is a China containment line. Unless China crosses it, it cannot advance into the Pacific, push back the US Navy, secure sea transport routes. Controlling Taiwan would instantly open the gateway to the Pacific for China. Indeed, Taiwan is the keyhole for the Chinese Navy. Therefore, geopolitically, losing Taiwan would be a fatal blow to national security. The Communist Party's legitimacy is at stake. This is the deepest reason. Since its founding, the Chinese Communist Party has declared Taiwan is part of China. Unification is a historical mission. If Taiwan were to become a de facto independent nation, the Communist Party's historical narrative would collapse. Its legitimacy of rule over the people would be damaged. Arguments like, then shouldn't Tibet and Xinjiang also be allowed to secede, would emerge. In other words, for the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan symbolizes the very credibility of the system. Especially Xi Jinping has explicitly stated, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, unification by 2049. Therefore, the Taiwan issue weighs heavily as the Xi Jinping administration's mission. Taiwan's semiconductors, TSMC, are the world's heart. Taiwan has TSMC, the world's most advanced semiconductor company, iPhone AI autonomous driving military systems. Nearly all cutting-edge industries depend on TSMC chips. Meanwhile, China cannot produce advanced semiconductors due to US sanctions, technologically stuck in a deadlock. Therefore, China regards securing Taiwan's semiconductor technology as a matter of national security. When these 3 factors converge, Taiwan is non-negotiable. The PRC's fixation on Taiwan stems from geopolitics, the breakthrough point for the first island chain; domestic politics, the core of the Communist Party's legitimacy; economy and technology, the existence of semiconductors; and TSMC. These factors converge simultaneously, making Taiwan for China a national core that cannot be conceded even by a millimeter. To summarize, Taiwan is China's military linchpin, first island chain. Taiwan is the symbol of legitimacy for the Communist Party regime. Taiwan holds the heart of global technology, TSMC. In other words, Taiwan is a triple strategic asset of geopolitics, politics, and technology, representing the red heart of the nation for China. Next, Chapter 18, the final chapter. What is the Taiwan issue ultimately? How should the world respond, and how should Japan engage? We'll synthesize the entire series to ensure viewers gain a complete understanding. What is the Taiwan issue? Its essence and future from the perspectives of history, international law, and geopolitics. We've finally reached the final chapter. Those who have followed this far will likely have already realized the Taiwan issue is not merely Taiwan versus China. It is the most critical geopolitical focal point of the 21st century, born from the complex intertwining of historical accumulation, gaps in international law, Cold War structures, US-China rivalry, and Japan's security. Today we will summarize this long journey into a single map through 5 key points. The PRC has never governed Taiwan. This is the fundamental fact of the Taiwan issue. The PRC, 1949 to present, has never exercised sovereignty over Taiwan. The ROC, Republic of China, has governed Taiwan for over 75 years. Therefore, the Taiwan issue is not an internal affair, but a situation of two governments coexisting. If you don't understand this, the entire discussion is off base. Without understanding this, all discussions are off base. Taiwan's status is undetermined as belonging to anyone. Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895. Became Japanese territory, 1945. ROC military occupation. Treaty of San Francisco, 1951. Japan renounced Taiwan. However, nowhere does it state to which entity Taiwan belongs. Furthermore, UN Resolution 2758 only decided that China's representation at the UN shall be the PRC, without addressing Taiwan's sovereignty issue. In other words, the current situation is Taiwan's status, under international law, has remained undetermined for 75 years. This is why the world treats the Taiwan issue as an international problem. Taiwan is a de facto independent state. The actual Taiwan has elections by its citizens, its own military, its own laws, its own passports, its own diplomatic channels. It functions completely as a state. However, because China has explicitly stated it would use force if Taiwan declares independence, Taiwan has chosen to neither declare independence nor unification, opting for maintaining the status quo. This is the most rational strategy. Why is a Taiwan contingency feared? For China, Taiwan is a gateway to the Pacific, a symbol of the Communist Party's legitimacy, and a treasure trove of semiconductor technology. Therefore, China treats Taiwan as the core of its national strategy. Meanwhile, Taiwan is a democratic nation, and most of its residents hold status quo, pro-independence views. This clash of values forms the fundamental tension structure of the Taiwan issue. The Taiwan issue is a matter of choice, not force. Ultimately, the fate of the Taiwan issue should be decided by the will of Taiwan's residents. This is also a fundamental principle of international law. The will of the people, self-determination, must be respected. However, in reality, China's pressure, US-China rivalry, Japan's security, semiconductors the heart of the global economy, the strategic value of the first island chain. These factors intertwine, making Taiwan's own choice difficult. Therefore, the world takes the position that maintaining the status quo is the most peaceful and rational approach. The future should be determined not by force, but by an international order that respects history, international law, and the will of the people. The Taiwan issue is not merely about a small island on a map. It is the interpretation of history, the gaps in international law, the tug-of-war between democracy and authoritarianism, the competition for economic and military supremacy, the security of Japan and the world, a 21st century paramount theme where all these elements converge. Yet, by organizing the facts, even the seemingly complex Taiwan issue can be understood along a single thread. It would be wonderful if this serves as an opportunity for viewers to gain the intellectual capacity to accurately understand the hidden history behind it all. Thank you for watching.